Introduce our speaker. I think you all know who Peter Beinart is. He is professor of journalism and political science at the Newmark School of Journalism at the City University of New York, CUNY. He's a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, an MS Now political commentator, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He writes the Beinart Notebook newsletter, and you'll be getting that link, by the way, on substack.com. His fourth book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, which was published by Knopf in 2025, won the Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction. Peter, we welcome you to Middle East Peace Now.
Thank you. So glad to be with you.
And I should have said too, thank you to everyone who hung in there with our rescheduling. Sometimes things happen, and we were very, very glad that Peter was able to accommodate us this evening instead of Sunday. So thank you, Peter, for that too. Okay, I'm gonna start things off with a couple of questions, and the first question is kind of an obvious one. Many of our readers are very familiar with your work, Peter, and some are less familiar. Please tell us about your background, how you got into the work you do, the books you have written, and where you are published and heard today. And I think we already know where you're published, by Knopf. So,
Thank you. Well, I mean, I've written about a variety of different things, but I would say the background to this current book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, was really my effort to wrestle with my own community, the American Jewish community, which is, structures my life, is kind of central to has been central for me since I was, as far as back as I can remember, and trying to understand why it is that so many people who, in so many other aspects of their lives, have great qualities of kind of compassion and empathy and intellectual curiosity on this question of Israel and Palestine, and then in particular on Gaza, somehow we're able to filter out this horrifying information that was coming about what Israel was doing. And so the book is really an effort to interrogate a particular Jewish story or set of stories, which I think are very, very dominant, pervasive in Jewish spaces in the United States and also in other places, which I think essentially do two things, which I think are very, very harmful. The first is they essentially tell a story of Jewish history in which Jews are kind of the permanent virtuous victim.
yes.
And so Palestinians or Hamas or whoever are essentially just considered to be the kind of reincarnation of these figures from both sacred history, like Amalek, this figure from Torah that Benjamin Netanyahu mentioned, this figure that kind of reincarnates essentially in every generation to destroy the Jewish people, or figures like the Nazis or the Tsarist pogrom. So the for instance, after October 7th, the things that people said again and again was this is the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust, as if the conditions that in Israel Palestine are similar to the conditions in Nazi Germany, or that it was a pogrom. And I think what this putting of Jews into the role of victims misses is not that Jews didn't suffer terribly on October 7th. It's not that Israeli Jews don't suffer. Of course they do. But that what this kind of narrative of permanent victimhood misses is that in Israel Palestine, unlike in many other cases in Jewish history where Jews were legally subjugated, in Israel Palestine it's Palestinians who are legally subjugated. That Israel has a system of Jewish supremacy in which Jews have full citizenship and rights, free movement, live under civil law with due process, and Palestinians in varying different ways lack those basic rights. The other kind of narrative that I try to critique in my book has to do with a relationship to the state of Israel that I think has verged on a kind of idolatry, in which the test of whether you are a Jew in good standing is not your relationship to Jewish law, which is the traditional metric for how Jews thought about what it meant to be Jewish. And Judaism is a religion of law. So do you observe, do you observe the mitzvot, the commandments? Do you keep Shabbat? Do you keep kosher? Do you visit the sick? Do you wash the bodies of the dead? These are the central foundational things in Judaism. But they in some ways have been eclipsed, replaced by the question, do you unconditionally support this state?
Mhm.
States, and my argument is that this actually represents a kind of worship of the state, making the state into a kind of an idol. That states, I argue, don't have inherent value. They are instruments for the protection of human life. That in Judaism, it is human beings that are created in the image of God, not states. States have only conditional value to the degree they protect human life. And when a state radically violates its responsibility to protect human life by killing vast, vast numbers of people, then in fact, you have a responsibility to question the nature of the state. Because what's sacred is not the state, it's the human being, which has incalculable worth. And I think this priority has been inverted in much of American Jewish discourse and much of American discourse, in which the central question is not, do all the people who live under Israeli control, half of whom are Palestinians, do they have a right to exist? But does Israel's particular political system have a right to exist? And my argument is that's not just misguided, but it's actually a kind of idolatry. And idolatry is perhaps the most grave sin in Judaism.
Well, we seem to be going through that a little bit here in this country, don't we?
Absolutely. I think this is a global, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think I'm often struck by the parallels. I look at some American Christians, particularly white American Christians, not all, obviously.
Yeah.
And I
Christian
think
nationalists.
And I think they seem to be worshiping a certain vision of the state and a certain vision of Donald Trump. And I'm not an expert on Christianity, but I've seen Christianity has a universal moral message, a message about the value of all human lives. And some of these people, when I listen to them, seem to think that if you don't have an American passport, you're worthless, right? And that worship of the state and the elevation of a certain notion of the state over the human being seems to me something that I think we see, unfortunately, both in Judaism and in Christianity. And also, actually, I think there's a parallel challenge in Hinduism as well, where you have this kind of worship of the state under Narendra Modi as also turning into a kind of an icon, even as the state brutalizes so many of its people.
Yeah. Seems to be human nature a bit. You mentioned, Peter, prior events in the history of Judaism and the suffering of Jews, and we know there has been much suffering over the eons. Do you think if the Holocaust had not happened, and because Zionism began before Nazism, obviously,
Yes.
do you think had the Holocaust not happened, would Zionism have taken over as the go-to mantra for the state of Israel?
I mean, it's such a vast historical counterfactual that is is very difficult to answer. I mean, I think we can say we could probably say a number of things. The first is that you probably would not have had nearly as large scale an immigration of European Jews
Yeah.
to pre-state Palestine. What you see if you look at there are kind of two things that really lead to a big increase of Jews moving to pre-state Palestine. The first is that America closes its doors in 1921. The vast majority of Jews leaving Europe wanted to go to the United States or Canada or South Africa or Australia or other Argentina. That is shut off in it because the 20s and then in 30s are actually a period a bit like this period of really dramatic kind of racialized nativism. And so the doors are closed to Jews. And the second is the rise of Nazism. So you see that the number of Jews who are immigrating to Palestine goes way, way up as Hitler comes to power and it becomes clearer and clearer how much of a threat he represents. So I think you probably would not have, I mean, by the eve of partition in 1947, you have about a third of the population of Palestine is Jewish. I think it probably would have, it was only about 10% in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was issued. So I don't think it probably would have gotten as high. That's one thing. The other thing is that the Nazi Holocaust, like any event needs to be interpreted and can be interpreted in radically different ways. So you have Jews who go through the Holocaust who lose their faith in God, and Jews who double down on their faith in God, and Jews for whom the lesson is a radically universalist lesson, and Jews for whom the lesson is a much more particularist lesson. But it is true that in the United States and in many other communities, the debate about the legitimacy of Zionism and a Jewish state, which is very fierce in the first half of the 1910s, 20s, even into 30s, really does end with the Holocaust and the creation of the Jewish state. And so there is this narrative that becomes dominant, which essentially says the lesson of the Holocaust is that if Jews don't have a state in which we rule, then Jews will not be safe, not just be safe, but subject to genocide. And that narrative remains very, very dominant today.
Thank you. Um, this is another question that steers more toward the present. Some journalists have asserted that there is a new anti-Semitism. Can you unpack that in the context of the definition of anti-Semitism that was included in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance of 2016?
Yes, this term new anti-Semitism really comes out of the 1970s. So prior to the 1970s, the kind of prevailing view among American Jewish leaders is to see anti-Semitism as part of the larger forces of bigotry and authoritarianism. It's kind of this principle that leads American Jewish organizations to be quite involved in the civil rights movement under the idea that kind of bigotry travels together. And that this is considered mostly a phenomenon of the right, fascists, of authoritarians, of reactionaries. But what happens after 1967 is that parts of the global and American left become much more critical of Israel. Israel is now occupying all of this new land, all of these Palestinians who don't have basic rights. The Soviet Union turns against Israel. After the 60 in this period, you have the Zionism equals racism resolution in 1975, and this kind of coincides with actually a kind of growing pride in Israel that among many Jews after the experience of the 1967 war, and it's in order to try to explain this new antipathy to Israel that the term new anti-Semitism emerges. And the essential argument is that the new anti-Semitism comes more from the left, and it's not focused on individual Jews, it's focused on the Jewish state. And so this is a form of bigotry expressed against the Jewish state. And this idea is still very, very, very pervasive. I would say if you look at the way people in the Anti-Defamation League and other American Jewish organizations talk, it's constantly the idea that if you're that the criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, either because it plays on anti-Semitic tropes or because Israel is being judged by a double standard. And so anti-Semitism is continually used to try to, I would say, regulate the degree to which one is allowed to be too critical of Israel. And the argument is that to oppose the existence of a Jewish state is anti-Semitic, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which is a kind of a kind of dominant assertion of American Jewish leadership. I don't think this argument makes any sense at all. In fact, I think it's very perverse if you think about it. Israel's political system is a supremacist political system. It's a system in which Jews have legal superiority over Palestinians in different ways. It's more dramatic in the West Bank than it is inside Israel, but it exists inside Israel proper as well, where Palestinians are citizens, but kind of second-class citizens. And so if you say you oppose supremacy and because you believe in equality under the law, that states should treat everyone legally equally, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, or race. That's not bigotry. It's actually the opposite of bigotry, right? Treating people equally under the law is not bigotry. The system that exists today is a system of structural bigotry. And so to me, there's something kind of Orwellian about this move of saying that if you want to turn Israel from a Jewish state into what people call a state for all its citizens, right? Which is actually the principle that progressives are fighting for here in the United States, right? I mean, this is our struggle too. Donald Trump and these people want America to be a kind of white Christian supremacist state. We don't. In fact, American Jews would be among the first people to object to this, and yet our leaders claim that if you try to apply that same principle to Israel-Palestine that we believe in here, that you're not just wrong, but you're a bigot, right? It just doesn't make any sense.
That's the whole conundrum of this is it, there are people who are extremely progressive and yet are extremely pro-Zionist. And trying to unpack this and figure it all out for the average person is not an easy task, I think. I mean,
No, but I also think it's part of the reason that we're starting to see a change because American Jewish discourse is different than Israeli discourse. Israeli discourse doesn't really have this duality, you could say.
yeah, yeah,
And Israeli Jewish discourse tends to be more straightforwardly supremacist.
right.
But American Jewish discourse has to deal with this, I would say, the moral and intellectual conflict between what American Jews want in America and what American Jews take pride in America, about the idea that American Jews have been an important part of pushing America towards becoming a more equal country, and yet a kind of a turning off that part of the brain when it comes to Israel and
That's what I
adopting a
mean.
completely different prism. And I think part of the reason you're seeing that so many younger American Jews are now actually challenging these ideas. There was a poll recently that came out a week or two ago that showed that among non-Orthodox American Jews under the age of 35, a majority prefer an equal binational state over a Jewish state, which is to say that a majority of young American Jews who aren't Orthodox have a view that the American Jewish leadership considers anti-Semitic, right? Which is crazy, but it's actually because they are actually trying to reconcile these two incompatible moral prisms, and they're saying, why don't we just take the one that we believe in here and apply it universally, including to Israel Palestine?
What a concept. Another question. Do you feel that anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism is factually on the rise, or is this perception created because anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel and its actions are being equated as the same thing? I think you
Yeah.
maybe answered some of this, but if you want
I
to
think
continue.
I think we have to we have to try to disentangle a couple things. I think actual anti-Semitism, by which it actually is on the rise, and it's on the rise for the same reason that Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, all of these things, because when Donald Trump says "Make America Great Again," what he means is returning America to an era where everyone knew who was on top, which was white, straight, Christian men, whatever, and then everyone else was
The
stacked
Aryan
below them.
race.
Yes, and of course, deeply misogynistic. And so it's really not surprising at all that people in the Republican Party and on the right who have been viciously racist and bigoted towards Muslims, towards Black people, viciously misogynistic towards women, that they would get around to Jews sooner or later. And they are getting around, especially among the younger right. People like you can see Nick Fuentes. You can see this in some of Tucker Carlson's commentary now, and Candace Owens.
Yes, yes.
So this really doesn't have anything to do with their views about Israel. Some of those people who are anti-Semitic like Israel, and some of them don't like Israel. There's something else which is happening, which is very challenging, which is the conflation of Israel as a state with Jews. So there are a lot of people who are very angry, understandably angry at Israel. And sometimes those people take out their anger at ordinary Jews, right? Or Jew, and so what I think, that can become anti-Semitic, right? Because just like it's wrong, remember during COVID, people were angry with the People's Republic of China because they claimed it had created they said it created COVID, and so then they attacked Chinese American people. That's
They
fundamentally wrong.
attract Asian American people.
Asian, right? They couldn't even tell if they were Chinese, right? So that's wrong. American Jews are not responsible for what Israel does. So we have to keep these things two separate, just like we would keep Chinese Americans separate from the Chinese government or keep Muslim Americans separate. You could dislike Iran, you can't, or ISIS, you can't take it out on Muslim Americans. The problem we have in keeping these things separate is that the American Jewish organizations are constantly conflating them. They're essentially constantly saying that to be Jewish means that you are a supporter of the state of Israel. And that actually is very dangerous, and it makes it much harder for us to combat this kind of anti-Semitism because we need to tell people that these things are separate and Jews are not responsible. But if you keep saying that Jews are inherently connected to the state of Israel and inherently supportive of the state of Israel, you make it harder to combat that kind of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. We here in Minnesota are dealing with that with the Somali community, which
Yes. Yeah.
is 98% law abiding. And
I know.
yet, so, it's
And, and this thing, if I can just say something about this, this thing with what they've done to Somalis and also what was done to Haitians
Yeah,
is also a template for what they're doing to what they're going to start doing to Jews,
yeah,
particularly ultra-Orthodox Jews.
yeah.
This claim that, you know, there's fraud in lots of different communities. The biggest fraud of all is happening with the Donald Trump and his family and the people around him, right?
Goodness, yes.
It doesn't mean that white Christian men are inherently duplicitous or should be deported. But this move to basically say there's something racially or culturally inherent about Somalis that mean that they are dishonest and therefore we can dehumanize them and deport them. If you listen to Tucker Carlson, they're now saying exactly the same thing about ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's a template that they are taking, that they're applying to other people, rather than saying fraud is bad irrespective of who commits it, and it has actually very little to do with your cult, with your religion and race and ethnicity,
Ethnicity.
because the biggest culprits of all are Donald Trump and the white Christians who voted for him in terms of fraud. I
Yeah,
mean, the guy's stolen for like $2 billion already.
yeah. More than that, I would say. I mean, they've stolen and now they're making more billions because of cryptocurrency and all the other lies
Yes,
that go with
yes,
it. So,
yes. The Times just put an estimate today of 2 billion, but I think you're right. It's probably higher
yeah,
than that.
yeah. We digress.
Mhm.
For many Americans, presidents have aligned this country with Israel, asserting that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and I put quotes around that. Please comment on both alignment and the statement. And I think we know
Yeah.
that, well, you speak about this.
So Israel is a democracy for Jews. It's a pretty robust democracy for Israeli Jews. There is a free press, that for Israeli Jews, there's an independent, fairly independent judiciary, but it's not a democracy for most Palestinians because most of the Palestinians under Israeli control, about two-thirds to three-quarters, live either in the West Bank or Gaza or East Jerusalem, which means that they're not citizens.
Right.
So they live under the control of a state where they can't vote for the leaders who have life and death power over them. In the West Bank, they live under a completely different legal system. They live under military law while their Jewish neighbors live under civil law. So this is in no capacity at all a democracy. There are a minority of Palestinians, those who are Palestinian citizens, sometimes called Arab Israelis, who do have citizenship and the right to vote. But even they have a whole series of laws that basically mean that their citizenship is second class. I mean, to use a crude analogy, you could think about like imagine America in the first half of the 20th century, what it was like to be black in Mississippi versus what it was like to be black in New York. In New York, you had the right to vote, whereas you didn't in Mississippi, but you still weren't an equal citizen in New York. And we could go into the many ways in which Palestinian citizens are not treated equally. So Israel again is it's a kind of a democracy in the way that America was a democracy during Jim Crow. It was a racialized democracy, a democracy for some, but not for others. You had to be of the right ethnic, religious, or in America's case, racial group. So was there a second part of the question? I think you're muted. I'm not hearing you.
I could hear my granddaughter, so I put myself on mute.
Okay.
I'll restate the first part of the question. For many decades, American presidents have aligned this country with Israel.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's a change, a shift? Not
Um,
with this present president,
right. I
but
think
is
there
there a
I think
general
there
shift?
I think there could be. I think there
Yeah.
could be. There is a huge shift in public opinion that's taking place. Really radical shift in public opinion among Democrats of all ages and among young Republicans. The only group of people who remain pro-Israel really at this point are older Republicans over the age of 50. But basically, Israel has kind of lost most of everybody else. And we're starting to see, it's painfully slow, but all of the work that people have done over the years is starting now, I think, to change the calculus of American politicians in the Democratic Party. We haven't seen it yet with Republican politicians, but with Democratic. So the number of Democrats who are now willing to say that they oppose military aid, vote against military aid, even talk about restricting arms sales has just dramatically increased. I mean, over the last year, and it's kind of moving quickly. So I think that there's a possibility that if the Democrats have a president in 2029, that president will follow a policy which is very different than Joe Biden's. It won't be without a fight, and I think but I think that there is a possibility that the impunity that Israel has had under presidents of both Democrats and Republicans, that we may start to end that.
Well, and we shouldn't just say presidents, we should say Congress.
Yes.
And you look at the number of people in Congress, fewer senators, more in the House of Representatives who are willing to stand up, and certainly candidates
Yes.
in the 2026 election.
Yes.
There are many election contests that may be decided on this question.
Yes. And we know that politicians are most concerned about keeping their jobs, most of them. And so when they see that, Daria Liza Vivelle-Chevalier beats Adriana Espaillat in northern Manhattan, or they see that Diana Gigette loses in Denver, then the message to them is, what do I need to do in order to not that happen to me? And one of the answers to that is you need to basically shift your policy on Israel to end American complicity with Israel's crimes. And so I think that's we don't have they don't have to you don't have to win every race. You have to send a message to the politicians that they are willing to change in order to try to hold their seats.
Right. We'll move on, Peter. Um, this one is a bit of a shift. What are the parallels between historic South African apartheid and the situation between Israel and the Palestinians? And how are these two situations different?
That's a great question. So the similarities are that you have systems of legal supremacy, in one oriented, South Africa oriented around race, in Israel oriented around ethnicity and religion, Jewish versus Palestinian. Um, you also have a tremendous effort in both cases to basically push the group that is made legally inferior onto smaller and less desirable pieces of land. Again, also you could see this in the United States too. What did the United States do? It pushed Native Americans into smaller and smaller enclaves. So in Israel, what you see is Palestinians are pushed first they're pushed, there's mass expulsion in 1948, and then even within the West Bank, Israel takes control of Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, pushes Palestinians into smaller and smaller enclaves. And now in Gaza, which is an area basically which was a kind of receptacle for all of these Palestinians who were expelled in 1948, now Israel is controlling 60-70% of Gaza, and Palestinians are confined to ever smaller ports of land. So in those ways, those two things, they're similar. One of the big differences is that the South African economy was very dependent on black labor. Israel is much less dependent on Palestinian labor than South Africa was, and this is one of the things that makes confronting Israel's form of apartheid much harder, because one of the most critical weapons that Black South Africans had was their labor power, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, was a very powerful, important ally to the ANC in the 1980s with mass strikes. In fact, Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, was the head of the National Union of Mine Workers. But Israel has a very different economy, which is not as dependent on that kind of. It doesn't need that labor, and what it has done, it is substituted a lot of for Palestinian labor with guest workers who have come from different parts of
Philippines.
Asia,
Yeah.
and so that means that in that way, it's very dangerous, because first of all, it means that Palestinians don't have that power. But secondly, it means that Israel doesn't need Palestinians around. South Africa could not essentially really afford to do the equivalent of what happened in Gaza, in part because it needed Black South Africans as workers. Because Israel doesn't need Palestinians as workers, it makes it easier for them to kill Palestinians. And I think that's part of the reason that even though South Africa apartheid was incredibly brutal, you didn't actually have as large a kind of a genocide like we've seen in Gaza over the last couple of years.
It's a very good point. I had not thought of that. Speaking of Gaza, I was listening to Mustafa Barghouti
Mm.
today and yesterday. He believes that Gaza will never be rebuilt.
Mm.
Do you agree? He thinks
Certainly on the trajectory we're on, it will not be rebuilt. I mean, Israel is, my understanding is that Israel has allowed in small amounts of food and humanitarian, but no rebuilding.
yeah, let
Nothing.
alone rebuilding. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, nothing that would allow you to rebuild the hospitals, the schools, the sewage system, the infrastructure. And I mean, Israel would justify that by saying that these things could be used for weapons, but even things that really have no potential I mean, there's been portable toilets, wheelchairs, these things are not allowed in. Yes, I think that again, I think we can step back and look at our own country's history and look at what happened in the United States in the 19th century with the destruction of the Native American population. Not every last Native American, but the destruction of Native American peoples to the degree that they could no longer resist. And basically, I think that what Israel is doing is making life, creating maintaining a system in Gaza where the message to Palestinians is you can never have a decent life here. This place will always, it was uninhabitable according to the UN before October 7th. Before October 7th. Now, I don't even know what words we could use to describe catastrophically uninhabitable, right? And so the idea is, well, maybe not all we know that Netanyahu wanted Egypt to open the border after October 7th. He was pushing that
He
very
would
hard.
get rid of them. Clear them
Yeah,
out.
so then if Egypt opens, you could have a mass exodus like you had in 48, like you had in 67. Egypt refused to do that, right? But I think the idea is you keep the pressure on, and sooner or later, at some point, whether it's a trickle or maybe a flood, Palestinians are going to go somewhere else. And the Trump administration is, in fact, the Israeli defense minister has said just recently that voluntary migration is Israel's policy, right? It's not voluntary when you destroy people's capacity to live and then say, wouldn't it be great? We'll get you a ticket to go to Somaliland or Rwanda or something. But that is essentially, I think, the policy of at least much of the Israeli government, if not all of it.
They have openly said that they will allow Palestinians and give them their blessing to, do they provide the means
I mean, I
temporarily?
mean, there ever since, I mean, there's a long history, Israel has a long history of promoting um, Palestinian migration out. But we've seen since October 7th, there've been a
Yeah,
lot of different versions of how to talk about this. One of them was that when the Trump plan came out, right, which was basically get rid of Palestinians and rebuild and build
make a
casinos,
resort. Yeah.
the Israelis embraced it. And now, just recently, Israel Katz, who's the defense minister, said that the policy was for voluntary migration. I think what they are hoping is that the Trump administration would basically bribe or threaten poor countries into being willing to take Palestinians. And then, so once again, Rwanda or whoever is basically willing to take people, then Israel would be happy to pay for their plane ticket.
How magnanimous. Uh, Turn to a question here. Please talk about the silence of many rabbis last fall when the Israeli Navy intercepted the Samud Solidarity Flotilla on the evening of Yom Kippur instead of honoring Kol Nidre.
Well, there are some rabbis who I think have met this moment. There's, rabbis for ceasefire, for instance, which is run by my friend Alyssa Wise, was among the first groups to basically do the direct action protests where people were arrested within weeks of October 7th. So I think it's important to say that, and I think those people deserve a tremendous amount of credit. Um, I
Absolutely.
think that the problem is that, but many, many of the rabbis exist within the ecosystem of organized American Jewish life, in which um, they they would imperil their jobs if they spoke out forcefully about what Israel's doing, and they would have, especially because a lot of these congregations are dependent on, like everything in American society, that people are dependent on people who have large amounts of money. And the people who have most power in the synagogues are the people who are the largest donors. And those donors are less likely than other people in the synagogue to be politically progressive on this question. And so rabbis generally oftentimes, unfortunately, follow the path of least resistance, which in the path of least resistance is not to criticize Israel except at the margins. I mean, people now like to talk about Abraham Joshua Heschel, who famously went and marched in Selma. But what they forget was that Heschel received a tremendous amount of criticism from other rabbis for doing that. First of all, the southern rabbis were very unhappy with him. And even many of his colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary, they did not want him to rock the boat. And so I think, unfortunately, religious, people who have the word rabbi in front of their name, just like people who have the name, ministers or imams or whatever, are also subject to these political pressures,
Yeah.
and and I think don't act with the moral courage that I would hope that someone who was, trying to be a Ben Torah, a child of Torah that they would act.
Um, could say the same of Christian pastors and priests. Absolutely. Very, very much the same. Um, Question from the audience. Do you think that the Israeli government and military are in favor of escalating and more visible anti-Semitism internationally so that the claim can be made that the only safe place in the world for Jews is Israel?
So I don't think the Israeli government, I don't think that that the Israeli government is out there, perpetrating anti-Semitic incidents, acts. But it is the case that the Israeli government is happy to partner with people who are anti-Semitic. I mean, the Israeli government's probably favorite leader in Europe was Viktor Orban, right? Who ran a very openly anti-Semitic campaign against George Soros in Hungary. They're basically Israel's strongest supporters and strongest allies in Europe are basically the fascist kind of neo-fascist parties like the AfD in Germany. And it seems strange, but actually there is a logic to it, right? And the logic is essentially that these far right parties believe that every country should be controlled by one dominant tribe, and that country should be as hierarchical and as ethnically, racially, religiously pure as possible. And so, from their perspective, Israel is actually a really good model because it does only allows in immigrants from the dominant tribe. It has a clear legal hierarchy, and so they want to make their countries more like Israel. But Jews in their countries are often a bit of a problem because Jews are not of the dominant tribe. And Jews very frequently oppose this kind of ethno-nationalism as small minorities. And so the far right has often believed that they like Jews much better when Jews are in Israel than when Jews are in their country, right? And from the point of view is from the and the, Zionism has always been based on the idea that Jews could never be safe and Jews could never be self-actualized outside of Israel. And so the anti-Semitism in some ways just makes the case for Zionism again. Herzl famously wrote, the anti-Semites will be some of our greatest allies, and in fact that was the case. That some prominent Christian Zionists in Britain were openly. I mean, Arthur Balfour himself, who issued the Balfour Declaration when he was foreign minister, as prime minister, had pushed through the Aliens Act, which shut off Eastern European immigration, largely Jewish immigration, to Britain, right? So again, there's nothing inconsistent about being someone who doesn't really want Jews in your own country and someone who thinks that Israel is great.
I keep thinking of our own country, and especially now during this 250th anniversary of our birthday, and how diversity seems to be so exalted, and yet underneath it all, not so much.
Yes, I'm not even sure it's exalted at all anymore,
Well,
certainly not by the
I'm,
government. Yeah.
the things you read, and we are a country of mosaic and da 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 da,
Yes.
and yet when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
Question about APAC. Please comment on the current role of APAC. How powerful does it remain, and how do we combat it? And I guess I would ask, do you think its power is waning? I guess.
Yes, its power is waning. It's quite remarkable. I mean, APAC, AIPAC really started to become powerful in the early 1980s, and its power was based on a network of activists and donors all across the country who developed relationships with politicians, usually early on in their careers, and by donating money, but also developing personal relationships with them, basically could have a big influence on their policy towards Israel, especially Israel in relationship with the Palestinians. And it was partly because there wasn't much pushing on the other side. It wasn't like there was a lot of money coming into politicians from pro-Palestinian donors, right? Um, and I and then when AIPAC saw that public opinion Democratic Party was shifting, once you had the election of people like AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, they doubled down by basically putting much, much larger amounts of money into these campaigns through the super PAC they created, which was they benefited from the fact that we have no campaign finance restrictions essentially in
Which
Florida.
basically is illegal because it's a foreign entity, but we won't go down that road.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole separate question. But
Yeah.
basically, and it did work for a while. I think it stemmed the tide, and they had these victories where they defeated Jamal Bowman in New York and Cori Bush in Missouri. But now, in the wake of the genocide in Gaza, public opinion has shifted so dramatically in the Democratic Party that a lot of Democratic politicians realize that the amount of money they might get from AIPAC related donors is actually is on balance not worth taking because because AIPAC is so unpopular. And so actually I think we're seeing, which is remarkable, and it's happened very quickly, that now AIPAC money is becoming kind of radioactive in a lot of places. And even the fact that AIPAC can, I mean, if no one will take your checks, then it doesn't matter how big a check you can write because people aren't willing to take it. Now, some of them are trying to kind of do it silently. And so one of the things AIPAC is trying to do is basically funnel this money in ways that won't be associated with AIPAC. And there are a lot of other groups that basically also basically try to funnel money to the same kind of candidates that AIPAC likes, because basically a lot of corporate and financial interests realize that candidates who are very close to AIPAC are not going to be very progressive on a lot of other issues as well. So they often get behind those kind of candidates. But I think the good news is that actually AIPAC is losing influence, especially in the Democratic Party. It hasn't happened yet in the Republican Party, but the really interesting thing to see in the Republican Party is whether we're going to see, you can see it with JD Vance a little bit, whether JD Vance is now going to make a play to try, because he can see where public opinion is going among younger Republicans. And I think that's the really interesting things to watch is what happens in the Republican Party.
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
We have about 10 more minutes. I'm going to say that 7:30 is our endpoint. And let me look at these couple questions here. Some observers assert that the true impediment to peace between the Palestinian and Israeli Jews is that both groups feel too deeply wronged and traumatized to ever make peace with each other. Is this true? Is this a cop-out or something else?
I, that's not really the way that I see it. I mean, it is true that both groups see themselves as traumatized and injured. There's no question about that. But I actually think that the reason that I think we are where we are is because fundamentally because Israel has a supremacist political system. And in supremacist political systems, people associate their safety with supremacy. So just like white Americans in the South and across the country believed that giving black people equality would put them in grave danger, which is what it was very common in the 19th century for American leaders to say, basically, if we don't have slaves, we will be the slaves. White South Africans talked exactly the same way, basically, that if apartheid ended, they would be slaughtered en masse. Protestants in Northern Ireland, same thing. The Protestant leader Ian Paisley, on the eve of the Good Friday Accords, which gave Catholics political equality, he called it a prelude to genocide. So this is the way that most Israeli Jews think, and it's not particular to them. It's typical of people in supremacist political systems. The only way in which those people think or willing to think differently is if they meet enough resistance such that that supremacist system stops working for them, right? The segregation would not have ended without the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement ultimately made forced white and the federal government forced white Southerners to think differently and be willing to imagine a different future. The problem is similar in South Africa. It was the internal and external pressure that forced whites to beginning to be willing to think of a plan B or a plan C. Plan A is always to continue with this supremacist politics. And because Israel has had almost complete impunity, right? It is not had to have that conversation about being willing to think differently about Jewish safety and to have people who might say, you know what? Let's actually think about a way in which about the idea that we could be safe under conditions of equality. I think that once the impunity ends, that you could potentially start to see a different kind of conversation in Israel, but it will only happen when Israelis face when the impunity ends.
Peter, I would add to that a different way of educating Israelis because, for how many years since 1948, schools in Israel have omitted a lot of history,
Yes.
shall we say. And
Yes.
and and they, I think a lot of Jews who are, Main Street type Jews who are not well read outside of their own enclave, shall we say, really believe that they are the victims in every sense of the word.
Yes, I think that's true. The question is, what would it take to get Israelis to start educating kids in a way that actually told them, talked about the mass expulsion that happened in 1948? It's not going to happen, I think, of its own accord. It will
No,
only, and so that's what I think it would. You have to, you need essentially a kind of Gorbachev or F.W. de Klerk-like leader. And Gorbachev and de Klerk did not come to their positions of ultimately participating in the dismantling of the Soviet Empire and of apartheid because it was their first choice.
they saw
Gorbachev
the
was a
light. They
communist.
saw the light on the. Yeah,
It's like when they say, like, when your horse dies, you get off,
yeah,
right? Like, it was only because they could see that it was just they could not continue in
yeah,
this path because the costs were becoming too high to them,
yeah,
and that we haven't gotten nearly to that point yet.
yeah. Although, as you and I would agree, and our audience, things are changing. They're economically, there's a lot of money leaving Israel
Mhm, mhm.
since Gaza started, and before. I would venture to say. So certainly, there are Israelis who are looking at them at at the situation and saying, this is untenable.
Yes, although in a way, if they leave the country,
Yeah,
right,
I
then
said the
then they're
money.
not
I said the
changing the
money,
country.
not the people.
Yes, there are economic problems, although it's also true, and this is incredibly dark, but that the war has been a huge boon for the Israeli arms industry because
Yeah,
Israel markets all of these weapons to
yeah,
countries all around the world as battle tested. And so a lot of other countries then say, oh, we want, I mean, this is also why Gaza is so horrifying and dystopian because what Israel did in Gaza now becomes a template for what other governments, which is this kind of AI, constant surveillance AI form of of warfare that will be coming to other parts of the world.
yeah. All right. One more question, probably. Mhm. For many years, those sympathetic. I see a question here, but I don't want you to answer this. I'll
Okay.
ask you to just uh, write back to me. What have you read or written recently that you would recommend? So, that's one for you to give some thought, and you can just send some ideas on that one. Okay.
Yeah,
Here's a question.
I don't mind throwing out a couple of things now.
Oh, okay, throw it out.
I mean, I think that
Other than your own books.
I mean, I think an old book, but still a really, really important book is Edward Said's The Question of Palestine.
Yes.
And I think Said's humanism is very, very, very important to kind of break through this the framing of a lot of this. So I think it's an incredibly important book. I also think that we're starting to see a lot of I think Tarek Bakoni's book about Hamas is a really, really valuable book to read because we, hear usually about Hamas in only this kind of very,
Terrorist
very
terms.
soundbite character. It's not an apologia for Hamas. I think there's lots of things to criticize about, but Hamas comes out of particular experiences and political choices and things that happen, and he puts Hamas in a context that I think is very, very important in understanding how it emerged and how it became important in Palestinian politics.
We'll add those two
Yeah,
to our follow-up, which we will do. Um, One more. For many years, those sympathetic to the Palestinians say this just can't go on. But in the past 2+ years, it has not only gone on, but gotten worse. Is there any off-ramp for Israel? Well, maybe we've talked about this. I don't know if you want to say more about this. What is the best that could happen? We haven't talked about this.
yeah.
And what is the worst that could happen in the next year? This person asks.
I mean, there are lots of terrible things that could happen. I think there's a possibility that Israel is going to launch another military offensive in Gaza, which I think Benjamin Netanyahu might find beneficial as he goes into elections. And so, I mean, lots of people are being killed even during this quote ceasefire, but in which the number of Palestinians being killed in Gaza could increase even more. I also think there's a possibility there's just kind of constant ethnic cleansing happening in the West Bank, but I think it's possible that if there were an uprising in the West Bank or some particularly significant act of armed violent resistance in the West Bank, I think it could produce the excuse that some in the Israeli government want to actually even do a much larger scale ethnic cleansing in the
Absolutely.
West Bank. So I think those are both very, very real fears. I mean, what I would like to see happen, or my hopeful scenario would be a couple of things. First of all, the United States doesn't just stop military aid, but puts very serious restrictions on arms sales. The Europeans then respond by ending the free trade agreement with Israel because Israel is more economically tied to Europe than it is the United States. And also then the US uses its leverage to pressure Israel to allow Marwan Barghouti and other Palestinian prisoners out of jail and to allow Palestinians to have a process to choose their leaders. I think it's really, really crucially important that Palestinians are able to create a unified leadership that can speak and offer a vision. This was something that was very important in the South Africa case, that people knew the ANC had legitimacy among Black South Africans and it was offering a clear vision. And Israel has managed to divide Palestinians, and you don't have a legitimate Palestinian leadership, really. There's been no Palestinian elections. I think if you had that, then I don't even know what the Palestinians would ask for. Would they still say they wanted a Palestinian state? Would they go back to the position pre-1988, which was sometimes called the secular democratic Palestine, or once they, I don't even know. But Palestinians have to be allowed to actually have that process to figure out what actually they're asking for in terms of in what way do they want to vindicate their rights. And then I think you have a force that Israel could actually have to deal with.
I'm thinking if we can get through the next 2.5 years, and if there's new leadership in this country, some of the good things might happen. But that's going to be the challenge. I don't
Absolutely.
know. It's not going to happen during this administration.
Yeah.
Peter Beinart, have reached the end of our conversation. We could go on and on. Thank you so very, very much for sharing your ideas, your experience, your wisdom with us. We very much appreciate all that you have shared with us.